Hi, I'm Jason. Yeah. Well, we've been starting the teaching time recently with some breathing. We're going to do that again today. We've been breathing, but we're going to think about the breathing. I'll start by letting you know that as we are, I think, 3/4 of the way through our extended teaching through Deuteronomy, today, Deuteronomy 26, is about first fruits and tithing. So the breathing this morning, instead of the first focus being on an inhale, maybe the first focus is on an exhale, because maybe many of us in the room need to get rid of some unhealthy teachings presented to us over the years that have made us feel guilty, who have manipulated us and made us feel obligated to do something. So if you would, just close your eyes with me and just be aware of your breath, and just be aware that you've been breathing already. Maybe just concentrate on an exhale, just trying to maybe get rid of the stuff that doesn't belong. It's had its space in your life. But it's time to go. Maybe it was useful for a season. Maybe it was destructive, but it's time to go. And just believing that as we inhale, God has something new and fresh for us this morning, that maybe it would just be for a season as well. I've said this many times, but the ancient rabbis believed that one of the ways to interpret this moment when Moses asked God who he was, Moses said, well, who should I say sent me? When God answered with this phrase, I am who I am, that maybe sometimes we call Yahweh, the name of God, might have just been the sound of breathing. Implying that God is the only alive one. All the gods of the nations are idols, they're little statues, they don't breathe, but this God breathes. And so you, my sisters and my brothers, you're breathing right now. You're made in the image of God. You have breath. Be thankful for that breath. Acknowledge that breath. Let's breathe in something new this morning and be willing to let go of the stuff that doesn't belong anymore. And so, God, would you teach us something? Would you show us something? Would you help us to understand what needs to be released and no longer belongs? We pray in and through the name of our Messiah, Jesus. Amen. All right, how are we feeling? Are we ready to hear something new about first fruits and tithes? Anybody ready for something a little bit less predictable, a little bit less manipulating? It's hard for me to do this. I'll just start with that. It's very hard because most teachings I've heard on first fruits and tithes go a little bit of something like blah, 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 make sure you give money here. And actually, we have financial reality, so it is so tempting for me to just take this passage and make it say whatever I would need it to say so that more money is here. And I just can't do it. Well, Deuteronomy 26 starts with, and my Bible has a subtitle, First Fruits and Tithes. And so if you've read through the Bible in a year or tried, you hit these moments and you just go, ugh. But what if there's something fresh? And what if this fresh thing has been sitting here for a few thousand years waiting for us? So the context of this, again, is Moses is teaching the Israelites what they are to live like when they enter into this land that's promised to them. Right? So they've been set free from slavery. They've been wandering for 39 and a half-ish years. They're about to enter into this land, and Moses is saying, before you go in there, there's some stuff you need to remember to do, stuff you need to remember about who you are, because this is the next generation. It's not the people that were set free, it's their kids. They don't even remember the getting set free part. And so if they don't hold on to some memory of where they came from, they might not really appreciate where they're going. And so Moses says, Okay, when you've entered the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance and have taken possession of it and settled in it, take some of the first fruits of all that you produce from the soil of the land the Lord your God is giving you and put them in a basket. Then go to the place the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name, and say to the priest in office at the time, I declare today to the Lord God that I have come to the land the Lord swore to our forefathers to give us. The priest shall take the basket from your hands and set it down in front of the altar of the Lord your God. Now I'll pause there. It's kind of familiar. We kind of just did it, but like we've watered it down significantly, right? Because you didn't grow crops and take the first fruit of the harvest and have baskets presented to you that would put on an altar. We got white plastic baskets, and we've got some paper in there that our government made that told us that it's worth something. And is this an altar? The modern church kind of adapted this ancient thing with the temple and tabernacle and the ways that they have an altar, and kind of presented maybe churches are built that we know that biblically in the New Testament we know that actually we are the temple. People. We're the temple. But we still kind of like to build buildings that kind of are like that, and they have purpose to them. And typically in those buildings, the front is the altar. But let me ask you, we're in Watauga High School right now, and we didn't pay $100 million to build this. The county did. We borrow it. We actually pay weekly rent to use it. Insert little thing about why it's important to give to your local church. But is this an altar? What do you think? Is this an altar right there? Is this more altar than there? No? Well, would you have said yes if we were in a church building and it had like little red velvety stuff? Would it have been then? So we're kind of mirroring something that's ancient, but we're kind of doing the watered down version. But we just sort of did that passage, right? You first fruits and you in the basket, and the priest brings it, and so we bring it up here, some tradition that maybe we didn't even realize we were following. Kind of put it at the altar. Unto you, O Lord. It's kind of a fun history moment for those of you that like to study other things. There's no specific command of how many crops they were supposed to use and what exactly. So the rabbis did what rabbis do, and they do this thing called midrash, where they go, could have been this, could have been this, could have been this. This isn't in Scripture, but it was taught among the rabbis that it represented, they were supposed to give the 7 major crops that land was known for producing. It was like that soil there in that promised land was known for 7 major things, so it was kind of interpreted that that's what they do. What does that have to do with anything? I don't know. It's fun to know. 7 major crops. All right, given it's at the altar, and then it says, then you shall declare before the Lord your God. Now what we're about to read now is what some consider to be the first liturgy in the Bible. Isn't that great? Liturgy meaning some sort of ritual that you go through. Whenever you go through that ritual, this offering, this thing that you do, you're to recite this exactly. And I say exactly, this is the English language, so I guess it's not exactly, but this is the first liturgy. Word for word thing to recite in a ritual unto God as a form of worship. It's the first that we know of that's corporately commanded as a liturgy. You ready? Now what do you think it would be? And some of you already looked down and went like, what? I would have guessed first liturgy, let's all say this together, and it's the offering, and you present the first fruits, and we don't really do this, with the fruit anymore, but you have the money or whatever it is, and you bring this first thing, and you lay it at the altar, and then it would probably, in my mind, would say, and then you say to the Lord, unto thee, O Lord, for your service and the something, right? I give this today in honor of the Lord's thing, whatever, something like that. Right, you with me? It says something like that. Here's the first line. It says, you shall declare before the Lord your God, my father was a wandering Aramean. And the people of God said, amen. I am so tempted, seriously, so tempted right now to end the teaching. And just be like, figure that out. Like we want to obey the Scriptures, right? We want to obey the spirit of the law is what we've called this extended teaching through Deuteronomy. The spirit of the law. And you provide the offering and you present it at the altars. This is the stage of the high school. And you say, my father was a wandering Aramean. I love the awkward tension of this moment. That probably means something cool, but I don't know what it is. Now, if you're like me and you like to zoom in on certain phrase or word that you'd circle and put a question mark, you probably it's the Aramean word. But really the whole phrase, why do you start with that? Father was a wandering Aramean. In Hebrew, Arami Oved Avi, sometimes translated, my father was a fugitive Aramean, or my father was an Aramean who was about to perish, about to die. It's a rare reference. It's still used in many Passover meals, just this phrase. Aramean. Well, father can be interpreted as actual father or ancestor, or it could be ancestors. Wandering, abad, it's lost, it's fugitive, it's, wandering. Aramean, Arami. So an Aramean, this is an ancient term. It's people from this northern region above that land that's promised. It's Assyrian. And so what you have is modern-day Syria. At one point was Assyria, which actually the Greco-Roman world named it that. Before that, they were the Arameans or the Aramites, Aram. Why in the world would you put your first fruits in a basket and give it to God, and the first thing you'd say is, my father was a wandering Aramean? From Syria. This land is Syria all the way to Iraq. Acknowledging my father was a wandering Aramean. So they're supposed to arrive in the land, settle in it, cultivate it, and then when they get their first fruit, present it in a basket unto the Lord, through the priest unto the Lord, and then they're told to recite this formulaic liturgy, which is really a compact narrative of the Israelite experience that starts with wandering nomad or nomads. Let's continue to read. My father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down into Egypt with a few people and lived there and became a great nation, powerful and numerous. But the Egyptians mistreated us and made us suffer, putting us to hard labor. Then we cried out to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our misery, toil, and oppression. So the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great terror and with miraculous signs and wonders. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now I bring the first fruits of the soil to you, O Lord, the first fruits of the soil that you, O Lord, have given me. Who is the wandering Aramean? Well, there's a couple different theories. It doesn't really say clearly in Scripture who it would be. Option one, there's a 12th century French rabbinic teacher named Rashban. Any Rashban fans out there? 12th century French teacher, Rashban, it says that this is Abraham. This wandering nomad from what maybe we would call the Arab world now. And actually, Abraham came from this city called Haran, and he traveled with his father. This is in Genesis, you can read this. Traveled with his father. They left this place called Ur, and they're on their way to what we now would call Israel, Palestine, or Canaan. And they ended up settling, before Abram left his father, they settled in this place, Padan Aram, this place of Aram. modern-day Syria and Iraq. Don't know exactly where. There's a region of Padan Aram, a certain part of Aram. And that's where our matriarch Sarai and patriarch Abram ended up coming from to move towards that which God had called them to an unknown land. And actually, Abraham refers to himself in Genesis 20. He says, God made me wander from my father's house. So there's a little bit there. Maybe he's the Aramean. He's from that region with his father. And then he left his father, right? His father worshiped other gods, and Abram heard God, the one true God, and started to move towards that which God was showing him, this land he would be shown later that ends up being the land that in Deuteronomy the Israelites are about to enter into. And so before you enter into this land, realize our father started out this journey wandering, and it took a long, long time. And it took so long that actually there was a famine. And in that famine, in order to survive and not die, we ended up becoming slaves. And we were slaves for a really, really long time. And then God, through miracles, set us free from slavery. And then we wandered for 40 more years, and through miracles, he kept us alive. And right before we go into the land, please remember that when we get in there, when we grow food and we wait, and we finally see some sort of thing come up that pops out of the ground, we will remember that our father was a wandering Aramean. We came from that place. I think Moses is essentially saying, Abram wandered by faith towards this land from Aram. Now we are about to enter into it, Moses didn't go in. You are about to enter into it. And when we get there, and we finally have harvest, we will not forget, right? Because when you plant something in the ground and then you wait. Well, let me ask you this. If you ever ask God for something, and you know this feeling where you ask God and you ask God and you ask God and you wait, and then it finally comes, and when it finally comes, you immediately just be like, thanks God, I'll take it from here. Anybody else? When you have this thing, you're like, come on, please, 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 please. And it's not there, and you feel so desperate for God. And then it finally comes, and you're like, got it. And then maybe you circle back and wait till the next time that you're in that desperate place. I'm a little bit better than I was 20 years ago, but I still have that in me, where I so easily forget. And when I'm in some sort of desperate need is when I'm really crying out to God, and when everything seems to be fine is when I tend to think that I somehow could handle this on my own. Fun side note, there's another rabbi, this amazing rabbinic commentator in the 16th century named Rashi. I don't know if you're a more Rashi fan than Rashban fan, but Rashi thinks it's Jacob. Well, they're related. I'm going to go either one. I lean more towards Abraham, but here's the reason. It could be translated as my father became lost because of an Aramean. And that changes everything about how you might interpret that. And Jacob was deceived by his family member Laban, who was an Aramean. Good luck, have fun. I'm going to go with Abraham for now. Either way, an Aramean is this person or people who went down to Egypt, went through a famine, in order to survive and not die, became slaves, miraculously set free from slavery by God, wandered for 40 years, miraculously provided for in the wandering in the desert, finally became farmers in the land that was promised to them, and then they waited and they waited and they waited, and finally when there's that first harvest, they circle back and they don't forget their ancestors were wandering Arameans. See how it kind of ties back in. And actually this offering is meant to go to the Levites, which are the priests, and the stranger, or the alien. It goes on to talk about a tithe going to a widow, an orphan. What I love about this is it wasn't cash, it's food, and even though they're giving it to God, they're supposed to share it and eat it with the Levite and the stranger. So the first fruit of what we're supposed to do is supposed to remember the wanderer. And this is the part also where I have a hard time saying this, but I think it's relevant to say. This could be interpreted as saying the first fruits of your labor. You work hard for it, but you acknowledge it's from God, and the very first that comes up, whether it be money or food, is actually supposed to go to the people that help facilitate the worship. And that's where it comes in, where it's hard for me to say, because it's like, could be said that it's for me, it's for our staff. And it's actually not entirely of a mistreating of the text, but I don't think it's really to the heart of it all. We do have financial realities here, and we have staff, and I think that matters, and I think people give towards that which they find important that they want to partner with. But I think deeper than that, because I think New Testament teaches that we're all priests, so then that hijacks that whole theory, that whole way to approach it, is that we give the first towards the Levite and the stranger because we remember what it was like to be a wanderer. Right? When we finally go into the land and we finally have our first fruits, it's to God, but it actually is used among people. Right? God gave his first and his best to people in and through Christ. Right? He's the firstborn over all creation, the first fruits of those who would resurrect, and then we also do the same, where we give our first and our best to God, but actually practically to people. It says to eat within your towns. You eat it together with this group. You know, if we set aside money for the Levites and the strangers, we always have something to welcome the wanderer. It helps us remember that we too were wanderers. It helps us remember, I think if we're honest with ourselves, that we too are wanderers. I think our culture needs a strong dose of this. Our Western culture needs to be better at being hospitable to travelers. If you've ever traveled outside the United States, the unbelievable hospitality that you receive puts our culture to shame in how we treat people who are traveling. But what if we thought about actually setting aside, not just setting aside something, but setting aside the first and the best of we have for those wanderers. And maybe you want to interpret this morning literally, or maybe more symbolically. It's realizing that our mission here, missional engagement that we have, is to welcome in and to love the lost. Or maybe just more literal. And I want to tell you how I kind of interpret this for myself, at least in part. I think the followers of God through Christ should be the best hosts in the world. And the following brief story I'm going to tell you, it might for a moment sound political, and I'm not really into talking about politics on this stage, and this has really got nothing to do with politics. There's a young man, who was actually part of our church here for a few years, and he is from Syria. He's an Armenian. He's a wandering Armenian. And he was coming to get a degree at App State, and he's Syrian, and his family was displaced, and they couldn't be in Syria anymore. And then they were in the city of Dubai, and then they couldn't be there anymore. And he actually, for a little window of time when he was visiting his family, was detained and wasn't allowed to come back into this country. Finally came back into this country. I had this moment where I realized, I don't know what the United States should do about this, but I know what I believe a follower of God through Christ should do about this is when he was in this, he was 22 at the time or something like that. He's in between. His family doesn't know where they're going to live. Thankfully, they found a place to live now. He didn't know where they were going to be. He didn't know if he'd ever see them again. He didn't know if he had a home. He was a literal wandering Aramean. And I just made a decision that if he doesn't know where he can be, that he just lives with us. If he wants to. He has a room, and we talked as a family with our kids, and this will be his room if he never finds another place to be. And I talk to his parents, and I go, I don't know what's going to happen, but he has a place with us. And because in part, I know that what it feels like to be lost. I know what it feels like to be a wanderer. And also, the father of our faith, Abraham, this father of this monotheistic way, believing that it's not these statues, there aren't multiple gods, there's not a separate God of the sun that's a separate God of the moon, that there is one true God, and that by faith we move towards and obey that God. That man and woman were wandering Arameans from this region of Syria and Iraq. And so I'm going to choose to remember. I want to show you something. We're going to pass something out. This has been waiting 17 years for this moment. our church, years and years and years ago, had these envelopes. You ever seen these offering envelopes, anybody? Raise your hand if you're used to seeing this at church, offering envelopes. It says Shepherd's Heart Ministries. This one has the number 84 on it. Shepherd's Heart Ministries. That's actually the legal name of our church. We call it the Heart. It's called Shepherd's Heart Ministries. It says loving people, loving God, and it has name, address, contribution amount. This is back when our church did this, obviously. But there are a bunch left over, and Terry Miller, who helped start the church 20 years ago, she realized she still had them in the archives. They've been waiting for this moment. And I say that because I'm really stubborn and abstract, and it's not waiting for this moment because we're going to start doing this again and have pledge cards and offering envelopes, but I want to suggest that we do something, kind of inhale something new with it. Can I hand this to you first, Chelsea? If you would, take an envelope, pass around the basket and grab an envelope. There's something I want to ask you to do. We'll start with this. If you have a pen or can borrow a pen, if you turn on the back and have a hashtag for you. A hashtag for the wanderers. Realizing that what God called the Israelites to do is to give their first and their best to the Levite and to the stranger. Not if you have something extra. And this is where it comes in. This is not, what's your salary, divide by 10, donate it to this church. That's not what this is. This is better than this. It's better than that. It's better than making you feel obligated to give to this particular organization, although we have financial realities. This is better. What if you realize that God has provided for you and that you will remember what it felt like to be a wanderer, or even better, or more real, that we won't forget the wanderers because we know deep down that we are wanderers ourselves. So what if this was something that you thought abstractly in some hypothetical, or maybe you just want to be real practical, because our church, we have a budget, right? And we have this thing called benevolence where we help people in need with their physical needs, and people call us and they are trying to figure out how they're going to pay their heat bill. So there's propane or whatever, and then there's like their power bill, or some people, they're in between housing and they're desperately trying to figure out where they're going to live, and they have it set up where 4 days from now, and we've had this actual story multiple times over the years, 4 days from now, they're going to be able to have some housing at Hospitality House, which we partner with as a church monthly. They have some housing set up so that they can have an in-between time for them to figure out what they're going to do next in their lives, but they have 4 days until then. And so what happens sometimes is our benevolence account pays for them to have a hotel room just to buy them a little bit of time to get to that in-between place. They are wanderers. And we have a line item for that. We also have this thing called missional engagement that's less about actual physical needs, and it's more about the remembering that what is this as a church we're doing? We're not just huddled together just to kind of remind ourselves of what we already believe, but also we want to engage with wanderers. There are people who are lost, people who are not quite sure who they are and where they are and what they believe. And so maybe this for the wanderer, maybe you're like, you know what, I kind of get it. I'll take it from here. And you just want to put some money in here so that when somebody travels from around the world and they visit you, you're ready to throw them the biggest feast ever. And that would, I think, be at the spirit of the law. So we can be more hospitable as followers of God through Christ. Or maybe you're like, I kind of get that, but now that I hear the benevolence thing and that kind of remembering like we have missional engagement and we're reaching people here, you just go, yeah, I want to help with benevolence because we've been talking a lot lately. Y'all, we want to increase the benevolence. We want to continue to give more to this community. We want to partner with more organizations. Thanks, Chelsea. We want to be the kind of people that steward this stuff well. And so maybe you just be like, that's pretty cool. All right, here we go. Lay it before the Lord at the altar in the basket. Or maybe it's something else. But if there's still some part of you that's like, this is really just a long con to get us to tithe at the church more, and you're like, cool history lesson, but I see what you did, it's still churchy, then just don't give it here. But listen, God wants you to give the very first and the very best of what you have for someone else unto Him. Do it. It's so good. Because when you do it, you're remembering what it was like to feel like a wanderer. You're remembering that you didn't come from nowhere. You came from somewhere, and that somewhere was you were a wanderer, and the father of your faith was a wandering Aramean. So you will choose to do this, whether it be personally or collectively, whether it be you put something in there for you to deal with and how you're going to deal with it, or if you just want to be a part of what we're doing kind of collectively in our budget, whatever it is. It's time for our first fruits to be for the wanderers. It's time for us to remember that we are not just doing this for ourselves. We are doing this to engage with and actively love the stranger. And that is at the spirit of the law of the first fruits and tithe. We need to remember that in order to have first fruit, a seed has to be planted in the ground. Or another way of saying it is, in order for there to be resurrection, there has to be death. This is actually supposed to cost us something. This is supposed to be an act of faith. And if you actually take this, if you go back to the original context of it being food and not money, if you plant seed and you cultivate the soil and then something pops out of the ground and the very first fruit that's produced, very first edible thing that comes out of the ground, if you harvest that and give that away, you actually don't know if there will ever be anything else. That's serious faith. It's not just divide by 10 and cut a check or go on to an app. It's like if you harvest this and give it away, there might be a drought. There might be a storm. You might not ever have any more crop. The beauty of it is, in a system that's designed to help out those in need, you actually eat it with those in need. And then if everybody lives like that, if you're the one in need, they give it unto the Lord, and then they share it with you. And so we actually have some stuff in our line items, or there's people from among our church family in need. So for some of you, you might be like, Jason, cool sermon, I don't even have a first fruit. Well, maybe that means that some of this is for you. And that's why it matters that we do these things collectively. So my sisters and my brothers, is there something that you've been waiting for and then it finally came, maybe one time or regularly or seasonally, that you want to thank God and not forget the wanderers, because you know deep down that you are a wanderer yourself? So choosing to say, my father was a wandering Aramean, and so I will not neglect the wandering Aramean. Think through what you want to do with that envelope. And realize that whatever it is that you're thinking through, at the heart of it, at the spirit of it, is not an add-on idea. It is the first and the best. And it's meant to be to help the stranger. Can you think of someone in your life that you want to connect with in that way? And or do you maybe want to partner with what we're doing here to do that collectively? So I wanted to close with kind of cheesy thing, but I thought this is the first liturgy in the Bible. And even though it's a bit odd, and even though it was actually originally given to the Israelites, and I think most of the people in here are actually Gentiles, I thought maybe we could read it together. And it would be like in the offering. It says, after you do this, that you're to bow down before God and present it to God. And so some of the rabbis actually noticed a discrepancy in this passage, a seeming discrepancy of, it says that the priest would lay it down before God, and then later on it says that the offerer would lay it down before God. And so they kind of did the good ninja theology where they went, oh, it's both, because they're giving it to God, but they also are giving it to the priest, and the priest is laying it down before God, and they're all sharing it together. And so they would bow down together, and this word bow in Hebrew means bless. And so if I would ask you, if you would you please stand, and we're going to read the first liturgy in the Bible together and try to get to the spirit of that. And if you want to, you can bow. Maybe you haven't done that in a long time, realizing that there's a reason why people have done this for thousands of years, why we bow to God. And in our culture here, what we do on Sundays, we don't talk about that too much, but I want to invite you to consider doing that. Or maybe you just want to have your heart bow to God, or maybe you want to get on your face prostrate, or maybe you just want to kind of the tilt version of a bow, or bow the head or something. But we're going to read this. I'll read that first line, and then we'll read the rest of it together out loud as part of a liturgy of what it means to be the kind of people that give God our first fruits and our tithes. Okay? Then you shall declare before the Lord your God. Here we go. My father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down into Egypt with a few people and lived there and became a great nation, powerful and numerous. But the Egyptians mistreated us and made us suffer, subjecting us to harsh labor. Then we cried out to the Lord, the God of our ancestors, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our misery, toil, and oppression. So the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great terror and with signs and wonders. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now I bring the first fruits of the soil that you, Lord, have given me.